The diner breathed in the damp afternoon air, its windows weeping with rain, and exhaled the scent of stale coffee and hot grease. Corinne moved through the narrow aisles like a dancer who knew every crack in the floor, her worn sneakers silent on the linoleum. At 19, she had already mastered the art of being present, but invisible, a ghost in a pale blue uniform who refilled ketchup bottles and wiped away the ghosts of other people's meals. The clatter of cutlery was her soundtrack, the low murmur of conversation her constant companion. Today, the rain had driven in a sluggish, irritable crowd, their dripping umbrellas pooling by the door. Corinne's apron pockets were light, tips were scarce when the weather was sour. She was calculating the distance between today's earnings and the rent due next Friday, a familiar and tightening anxiety in her chest. She paused at a small booth in the back, where an old man sat alone. He'd been there for over an hour, nursing a single cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His hands, spotted with age, trembled slightly as they cradled the ceramic mug. He was neatly dressed in a clean but threadbare coat, his posture stooped not just by age, but by a kind of weariness that seemed to settle deep in his bones. He stared out the window, his gaze distant, as if watching a world that had long ago stopped watching him back. Corinne had refilled his cup twice without being asked, each time earning a quiet, almost surprised, nod of thanks. Her manager, Mr. Henderson, a man whose smile was as thin as his patience, had already pointed him out. "Don't let him camp out," he grumbled, his eyes scanning the room for paying customers who needed the table. This isn't a library, but Corinne ignored him. There was a stillness about the old man that reminded her of her grandfather, a quiet dignity that asked for nothing. Finally, the man signaled for the check. Corinne brought it over with a small, genuine smile. He fumbled in his coat, pulling out a worn leather wallet. He produced a credit card and slid it onto the small plastic tray. Corinne took it to the register, swiped it, and waited. The machine beeped, a sharp, clinical sound.
Declined.
She tried again. Declined. Mr. Henderson materialized beside her, his presence a cold draft. "What's the problem?" he asked, his voice already laced with accusation. "The card won't go through," Corinne said softly. Mr. Henderson snatched the check from her hand, his eyes narrowing on the $2 total. He marched over to the booth, his footsteps loud and heavy in the suddenly quiet diner. The old man looked up, his expression shifting from placid reflection to a dawning, terrible awareness. He knew this particular brand of public theater. It was a play he had been cast in before. "Sir," Mr. Henderson began, his voice carrying across the room, each word a small, sharp stone aimed at the old man's composure. "Your card was declined. Do you have another way to pay?" The old man's face, a roadmap of wrinkles, flushed a painful, blotchy red. He began patting his pockets, a frantic, bird-like motion. I am sure I have some cash," he murmured, his voice a dry whisper. A few customers at a nearby table turned to watch, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The air grew thick with unspoken judgment. Corinne stood by the register, her hands clenched into fists inside her apron pockets. Every instinct screamed at her to intervene, to shield him from the slow-motion car crash of his own humiliation. She felt a familiar, hot anger rising in her throat, quiet and intense. It was an anger she reserved for bullies, for people who used their sliver of power to make others feel small. The old man finally pulled out a handful of coins and a single, crumpled dollar bill. He carefully spread the change on the table, his trembling fingers sorting through the pennies and dimes. He counted, his lips moving silently. Then he looked up, his eyes filled with a deep, bottomless shame. "I am short," he said, his voice barely audible. 37 cents, Mr. Henderson let out an exaggerated sigh, a sound of pure performance. "Look, I can't run a business giving out free coffee. If you can't afford to pay, you shouldn't be ordering." The words hung in the air, brutal and final. The snickers from the nearby table were quiet but sharp enough to cut. That was it. Corinne moved before she could think, her body acting on a principle so deeply ingrained it felt like breathing. She walked to the booth, her gaze fixed on the old man, deliberately ignoring her manager. She reached into her apron, her fingers finding the $5 bill she'd been saving for her bus pass, the one she'd been counting on. She smoothed it out and placed it gently on the table next to his scattered coins. "I've got it," she said, her voice soft but clear, a small island of calm in the sea of his embarrassment. "Don't you worry about it." The old man stared at the bill, then up at her. His eyes, which had been cloudy with shame, were suddenly sharp, analytical. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't say thank you. He simply gathered his coat, stood with a newfound straightness in his spine, and walked out of the diner into the pouring rain, leaving the $5 bill untouched on the table. Mr. Henderson's fury descended on Corinne instantly. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Are you trying to make me look bad? That comes out of your pay. This is a business, not a charity ward." Corinne simply picked up the $5, added it to the man's coins, and paid his bill. She kept the change. Her defiance was quiet, but it filled the space between them, an unbreachable wall of her own making. The rest of her shift was a blur of cold shoulders and clipped commands from Mr. Henderson. The weight of his threat pressed down on her, a constant, dull ache behind her ribs. The diner, usually a place of predictable rhythm, now felt like a hostile territory. When she finally clocked out, the rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, coating the city in a slick, gray sheen. The bus ride home was long and damp, the windows fogged with the breath of tired commuters. Corinne leaned her forehead against the cool glass, watching the streetlights bleed into watery streaks. The $5 she had used felt like 100. It was the difference between taking the bus all week or walking the last 2 miles from the cheaper stop. It was the cost of a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. It was a small sacrifice, but her life was built on small things, and their absence was always keenly felt. Her apartment was a single room above a laundromat, always smelling faintly of soap and steam. It was small and sparsely furnished, but it was hers. She kept it meticulously clean, a small act of control in a life that often felt dictated by outside forces. After changing out of her uniform, she sat at her small kitchen table and opened a worn ledger. She wrote down her earnings for the day, the number depressingly small. She subtracted the $5. The final tally made her stomach clench. Rent was a hungry beast, and she was falling behind in feeding it. A wave of exhaustion washed over her. Why had she done it? Why risk her job, her precious little money, for a complete stranger? The answer wasn't logical, it was visceral. It lived in a memory from when she was 9 years old. She had been at a grocery store with her grandfather, a man who had worked with his hands his entire life and carried himself with the quiet pride of someone who owed no one anything. He had miscounted his money, coming up short for a bag of oranges. The cashier, a young woman with bored, cruel eyes, had sighed loudly and announced to the growing line, "He can't pay." The shame that had flooded her grandfather's face was something Corinne had never forgotten. He had shrunken on himself, his broad shoulders slumping as he apologized and put the oranges back. In that moment, he wasn't her strong, invincible grandfather anymore. He was just an old man being made to feel worthless over a piece of fruit. Corinne had squeezed his hand, her small heart burning with a helpless rage. She had promised herself then, in the silent, ferocious way a child makes a vow, that she would never stand by and watch someone be stripped of their dignity like that. Not if she could help it. That was why she had paid for the coffee. It wasn't about the money. It was about the oranges. It was a debt she was paying to a ghost, a promise she was keeping to a little girl. 2 days passed in a tense, watchful quiet. Mr. Henderson treated Corinne with a frosty professionalism, making it clear she was on thin ice. She worked harder than ever, her smiles a little brighter, her movements a little faster, trying to become too valuable to fire. She walked the extra 2 miles from the bus stop each night, her feet aching, the $5 ghost haunting every step. On the 3rd day, the rain had finally stopped, and a weak afternoon sun was trying to break through the clouds. The lunch rush was over, and the diner had settled into its usual lull. Corinne was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up, expecting a regular, but instead saw a man in a dark, perfectly tailored suit. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence so immaculate and sharp-edged that he seemed to have stepped out of a different world entirely. He scanned the room, his eyes missing nothing, before they landed on her. He walked directly to the counter. "I am looking for Corinne," he said. His voice was deep and smooth, with a slight accent she couldn't place. Panic flared in Corinne's chest. This had to be about the old man. Maybe he was family, and they were here to complain, to say she had embarrassed him. "I'm Corinne," she managed, her voice tight. "May I have a word with you outside?" he asked. It wasn't really a question. Mr. Henderson scurried over. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked, his tone sycophantic. The man in the suit didn't even glance at him. He just kept his eyes on Corinne. "It is a private matter." Heart pounding, Corinne untied her apron and followed him out onto the sidewalk. The city air felt cool on her flushed cheeks. Parked at the curb was a long, gleaming black car, the kind she had only ever seen in movies. It was so polished it reflected the sky. The man in the suit opened the rear passenger door. "He would like to speak with you." Corinne peered into the car's shaded interior. And there he was, the old man from the diner. But he was not the same man. He was wearing a suit of deep gray silk that fit him perfectly. His stooped posture was gone, replaced by an erect, commanding stillness. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a sharp, piercing intelligence. The frail, trembling hands now rested calmly on a silver-headed cane. He was still old, but he was no longer feeble. He was powerful. The transformation was so absolute it took her breath away. "Please," he said, his voice no longer a dry whisper but a rich, resonant baritone. "Join me." Numbly, she slid onto the plush leather seat. The door closed with a soft, expensive thud, sealing them in a world of silence and the faint scent of cedar. He turned to face her, his gaze unwavering. He introduced himself as Park Jin-woo. Then he asked the question that had clearly been weighing on his mind, the question that had brought this car and this suit and this new reality to the doorstep of her humble diner. "Why?" he asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "Why did you do it?" Corinne looked at the man beside her, this stranger who had shed one identity for another as easily as shrugging off a coat. The question hung in the silent, luxurious space of the car. He wasn't asking about the money. He was asking about the motive, the root of the impulse that had made her step forward when everyone else had stepped back. She took a breath, the scent of leather and clean air filling her lungs, a stark contrast to the diner's greasy perfume. She decided to tell him the truth, or at least the part of it that mattered. "Because no one should be made to feel that way," she said, her voice finding its strength. To be made to feel small and worthless in front of a room full of people. Especially not for something as simple as a cup of coffee. She looked down at her hands, still calloused from work, and thought of her grandfather's hands, just as worn. Dignity isn't something you should have to pay for. It should be free. She didn't mention her grandfather or the oranges. The memory was too private, too sacred to offer up to a stranger, no matter how well dressed. But the feeling, the core belief it had forged in her, was there in her voice. Mr. Park watched her, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. He nodded slowly, as if she had just confirmed a complex hypothesis. "I have spent many years building a life for myself," he said, his gaze turning to the window, to the bustling, indifferent city outside. An empire, some would call it. But in such a world, truth becomes a rare commodity. Loyalty is bought, respect is manufactured. "It is difficult to find something real," he turned back to her. "I have been conducting an experiment. I visit places like this diner, dressed as I was, to see the world from the ground up, to see how people treat a man who appears to have nothing. It has been a deeply disappointing experiment." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "Until you," the intensity of his stare made her shiver. "I am offering you a position," he said, the words precise and deliberate. "I run a number of charitable foundations. They require a director of outreach, someone to be the human face, to assess need with compassion, not just calculation. The salary would be substantial. You would never have to worry about rent again. Corinne stared at him, bewildered. A job? A foundation? It was too much, too sudden. It felt like a dream, and she was wary of dreams. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm a waitress. I don't know anything about running a foundation. You know about dignity, he countered swiftly. You know about kindness when it costs you something. That is a qualification no university can teach, and no amount of money can buy. I can teach you the rest. The offer was a lifeboat, a golden, impossible lifeboat appearing in the middle of her stormy sea. But life had taught her that nothing was free, and she couldn't see the price tag. The sheer unreality of the situation was dizzying. One moment she was worrying about a $5 deficit. The next she was sitting in a car that cost more than her entire building, being offered a life she couldn't have even imagined. Suspicion, a survival instinct honed by years of scraping by, coiled in her gut. People like him didn't just hand out opportunities to people like her. There was always a catch, a hidden clause, a price to be paid later. Why me? She asked again, needing to understand. I'm sure there are hundreds of people more qualified. They are qualified in finance and logistics and law, Mr. Park said patiently. I have plenty of those people. I am looking for someone qualified in humanity. That is a much smaller pool of candidates. He saw the doubt still clouding her face. I am not asking for an answer now. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a slim, heavy business card. The lettering was embossed in a language she didn't recognize, save for his name and a phone number. Take a week. Think about it. This is the number for my personal assistant. He will answer any questions you may have. The offer is real, and it will be waiting for you. She took the card. It felt cool and impossibly smooth in her palm. The door opened, and the man in the suit was there, his face impassive. She stepped back onto the cracked pavement in front of the diner, the black car silent, alien vessel on the familiar street. It pulled away from the curb with a whisper of power and disappeared into traffic, leaving her standing there with a piece of cardboard that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat in her small room, the card on the table in front of her, a stark white rectangle in the dim light. She thought about Mr. Henderson's sneer, the ache in her feet, the constant, grinding worry about money. Then she thought about the offer. It was an escape hatch. But to where? She did the only thing she ever did when her world felt unsteady. She called her grandmother. She explained the whole bizarre story, from the old man in the diner to the man in the suit and the impossible job offer. Her grandmother listened patiently, her silence a comforting presence over the phone line. When Corinne finished, her grandmother was quiet for a long moment. A wolf can wear a sheep's coat, baby girl, she said, her voice warm but edged with caution. And a rich man's charity can sometimes be just another way of buying power. But what if it's real, Grandma? Corinne asked, twisting the phone cord. What if he's just a good person who wants to do a good thing? Then you have to ask yourself if that's a world you can walk in without losing your own 2 feet, her grandmother replied. Don't you ever trade your soul for a paycheck. But don't be so afraid of a blessing that you turn it away at the door, either. You trust your gut. It's never steered you wrong yet. Corinne hung up the phone, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. She looked at the card again. She thought of Mr. Park's eyes. They hadn't been manipulative or deceitful. They had been tired, yes, but also clear and direct. He had looked at her with a kind of profound respect. She had stood up for his dignity, and now he was offering her a chance at her own. It was a risk. But staying at the diner, slowly being ground down by petty cruelties and endless worry, was a risk too. It was the risk of forgetting who she was. She picked up her phone and dialed the number on the card. Her new life began with the whisper of an elevator ascending to the penthouse floor of a downtown skyscraper. The office was a study in minimalist elegance, glass, steel, and a panoramic view of the city that made the world below look like a toy set. Corinne, dressed in a simple but new black dress she'd spent half her final paycheck on, felt as out of place as a sparrow in an eagle's nest. But Mr. Park, or Jinwoo as he insisted she call him in private, was a patient teacher. He explained that his foundations were indeed real, a complex network of charities that funneled money to hospitals, schools, and community shelters. He was a man of profound dualities, capable of ruthlessness in his business dealings, the exact nature of which remained shrouded in polite mystery, yet driven by a fierce, almost obsessive code of honor to protect the vulnerable. Her job was to be his eyes and ears on the ground, to find the people who didn't know how to ask for help, the ones who would suffer in silence rather than endure the shame of begging. Her first assignment was to review a stack of grant applications. She read stories of families facing eviction, students choosing between tuition and food, elderly people unable to afford medicine. These weren't just files, they were lives, distilled into black and white text. She worked with a focus and empathy that impressed Jinwoo's entire staff. She saw the details others missed, the quiet desperation between the lines. A montage of new experiences began to shape her days. She found herself in boardrooms, her quiet, morally clear insights cutting through the jargon of men twice her age. She visited shelters, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as someone who understood the chill of a threadbare coat. She sat with Jinwoo in elegant restaurants, learning about a world of art, music, and history she'd only ever read about. During one such dinner, a young couple at a nearby table was staring at their bill with pale, anxious faces. The man was trying to discreetly slide his credit card back into his wallet after it was declined. The woman was blinking back tears. Jinwoo caught Karen's eye, a silent question passing between them. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He signaled the waiter, and with a quiet word, paid their bill anonymously. As they left, he murmured, "Dignity should be free." It was a direct echo of her own words, a sign that he had not just heard her, but understood. Their relationship evolved. The lines between employer and employee blurred into a deep, respectful friendship. He told her stories of his youth in Korea, of arriving in America with nothing, of the countless doors slammed in his face. He never used the word mafia or gangster, but he spoke of creating his own family, his own set of rules, a system of justice and protection in a world that offered him neither. She, in turn, told him about her grandfather and the oranges. In the safety of his company, the story was no longer a private wound but a shared value. He wasn't just her boss, he was becoming her confidant, her closest friend. Karen's world expanded, but she herself remained unchanged at her core. She wore designer clothes now, a gift from Jinwoo who insisted she dress for the world she commanded, but she never lost the muscle memory of an aching back and worn-out shoes. Her humility wasn't a performance, it was the bedrock of her character, and Jinwoo treasured it. He saw that power hadn't corrupted her, it had only amplified the kindness that was already there. He found himself relying on her moral compass, not just for his philanthropic work, but for his own soul. She was his anchor to the principles he had fought so hard to build his empire on, principles he sometimes feared he was losing in the rarefied air of wealth and influence. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of his penthouse, the city lights glittering below like a fallen constellation, he confessed something more. "When I first started my experiment," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I was looking for an heir. Not of blood, but of spirit. Someone who could carry on my work with the right heart." He turned to her, his face serious in the twilight. "But after I met you, I realized I was looking for the wrong thing. I was not looking for a successor. I was looking for a partner. A wife." The word hung in the air between them, shimmering and immense. Karen's heart stuttered. She had felt the pull between them, the deepening affection that went far beyond friendship, but she had been too afraid to name it. "I have more money than I could ever spend," he continued, his voice soft with a vulnerability she had never heard before. "I have power that can move mountains. But I am lonely, Corinne. I want to share my life with someone who sees the man who was once short 37 cents for a cup of coffee, not the man who owns this building." He reached across the small table and gently took her hand. His touch was warm and steady. "This is not a business proposal. I am asking you, Corinne, if you would be willing to have dinner with me. Not as my employee, not as my protégé, but as a woman I deeply admire and have grown to love. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of shock and a profound, bone-deep recognition. She saw him not as a powerful tycoon or a feared underworld figure, but as a man who, like her, understood the weight of loneliness and the value of being truly seen. Yes, she whispered. I would love that. Their first date was the beginning of a quiet, tender courtship. He showed her the man behind the myth, and she showed him a world of simple joys he had long forgotten. They found in each other a shared home, a sanctuary built on a foundation of mutual respect and a simple act of kindness in a rain-swept diner. A year to the day they had their first real date, they sat in a restaurant that was the pinnacle of fine dining. The lights were low, the tablecloths were crisp white, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Corinne, in a simple, elegant emerald dress, felt a sense of peace and belonging that was no longer new, but a comfortable and cherished part of her life. Jin-woo watched her from across the table, his eyes filled with a love so deep it was a tangible presence between them. Their quiet celebration was interrupted by a commotion at a nearby table. A young man, flushed with wine and arrogance, was berating a waiter. Are you an idiot? He sneered, his voice loud enough to make heads turn. I said no olives. Are you incapable of understanding a simple instruction? The waiter, a young man not much older than Corinne had been when she worked at the diner, was pale and trembling. My apologies, sir. I will have it remade immediately. The manager rushed over, his face a mask of frantic placation. The arrogant customer was clearly important, a regular with a deep pocketbook. Fire him, the customer demanded, pointing a dismissive finger at the waiter. I don't pay this much to have my meal ruined by incompetence. The manager began to stammer an apology, clearly about to sacrifice his employee to appease the customer. Corinne felt a familiar surge of quiet, protective anger. It was the same feeling she'd had watching Mr. Henderson humiliate Jin-woo. She looked across the table. Jin-woo met her gaze and gave a single, almost invisible nod. It was all the permission she needed. She stood up and walked over to the table, her movements calm and deliberate. She placed a gentle hand on the waiter's arm, a small gesture of solidarity, before addressing the manager. Excuse me, she said, her voice not loud, but carrying a weight that made everyone at the table fall silent. My fiancé and I were just about to leave. The manager's eyes widened as he recognized Jin-woo, one of the city's most powerful and reclusive figures. Is there a problem with your service, madam? He asked, his tone shifting instantly from panicked to deferential. The service has been wonderful, Corinne said, looking directly at the terrified waiter. But we cannot dine in an establishment that allows its staff to be treated with such profound disrespect. We will be taking our business, and that of our associates, elsewhere from now on. She then turned to the arrogant young man. Unless, of course, the matter can be resolved. Perhaps by you accepting the waiter's apology and treating him with the basic human decency he deserves. She reached into her clutch purse. In fact, to smooth things over, allow us to cover your bill for the evening. The reversal was stunning. The public shaming was turned back on its perpetrator. The manager, seeing his restaurant's reputation and a massive source of revenue about to walk out the door, fell over himself to apologize to the waiter and reprimand the customer. The young man, utterly deflated and embarrassed, mumbled an apology. Corinne had become the protector. She now wielded power, not with threats or cruelty, but with the same quiet grace she had used when all she had was a $5 bill and a belief in doing the right thing. Back in the quiet sanctuary of their car, the city lights streaming past the windows, Jin-woo took her hand. It wasn't the trembling, age-spotted hand she had first seen, but a strong, warm hand that held hers with a sense of reverence. He was silent for a long time, watching her, his face full of an emotion that was deeper than pride, closer to awe. In all my life, he said finally, his voice thick with feeling, I have seen people use power to crush others, to take, to dominate, to instill fear. I have never seen someone use it so gracefully to lift someone up. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. That is why I love you, Corinne. Your kindness is not a weakness. It is the most formidable power I have ever witnessed. It is the core of who you are, and it has not wavered. Not for a moment. He reached into his coat pocket, but instead of a business card, he pulled out a small, velvet box. He opened it. Inside, a simple, elegant diamond rested on a platinum band, its fire seeming to capture all the light in the car. I asked you to be my partner, he said, his voice dropping to a low, earnest whisper. Now I am asking you to be my wife. To build a life with me, a legacy, not of wealth or fear, but of dignity. Tears streamed down Corinne's cheeks, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. This moment was not the end of a fairy tale, but the beginning of a real and profound partnership. Yes, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, Jinwoo. Of course, yes. Their wedding was not a grand affair for the society pages. It was a small, private ceremony, attended only by their closest chosen family, including her grandmother, whose eyes shone with pride. The final scene of their story did not take place in a penthouse or a mansion. A few months later, they sat in a booth in a small, clean, brightly lit diner on a quiet side street. The smell of fresh coffee and baking bread filled the air. This diner was theirs, the first project of their newly combined foundation. It was a place that paid its staff a living wage, and its one unbreakable rule was that every single person who walked through the door was to be treated with respect and kindness. A cup of coffee was just a cup of coffee. Jinwoo reached across the table and covered her hand with his. On her finger, the diamond gleamed. Happy, Mrs. Park? He asked, a gentle, teasing smile on his face. Corinne looked around the room, at the diverse crowd of people laughing and talking, at the waitress treating an elderly man with a gentle patience that warmed her soul. She looked back at her husband, the man whose hidden heart she had found by chance, and whose life was now inextricably woven with her own. More than you could ever know, she said. The steam from their coffee cups rose and mingled in the air between them, a small, warm cloud in a place built on the radical idea that a little bit of kindness could change everything.